Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fallon, I want to express my heartfelt thank you for being here today. Those of us who were here on January 6th, in no small part, owe you and others a debt of gratitude for the work you did, ushering people into, members of Congress and others into safety. And I truly appreciate that, and thank you.
Thank you, sir.
If this were only about January 6th, that would have been my last comment, and we'd be done. I'm going to ask a series of questions that I think beg the question of something beyond January 6th. For all of you, if you'd raise your hand, are there any of you who think that it would be better if we had the same rules of discovery that China, Cuba, Russia, Iran have from a standpoint of looking for criminals among us? Is there anyone here that would raise their hand? I thought not. For all of you, let's ask some questions, and I'll use Mr. Tedesco as my straw man for a moment. With the way the Bank Secrecy Act has been used, is there anything that stops an administration from choosing to look at and gather, strip away and get from the major banks or all the banks, all the data of all the citizens and participants in our society? In other words, simply haul it all in so they have a database for whatever they need to do, whether it's January 6th or, somebody driving in town and not paying a parking ticket.
Sure. I don't know the Bank Secrecy Act particularly well. I know the First Amendment implications of the way in which
I'm really looking at the Fourth Amendment for a moment.
Sure.
Again, for the others, Mr. Knight, I think you answered on this. Really, there's nothing that would stop an administration in secret from taking vast amounts, potentially all of it, under current law. The only question you'd really ask is, can you later go to court and say it was excessive, and would the court side with you? But from a functional standpoint, what they ask for at the FBI, they get. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, Representative. In fact, I think it's even worse than that, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily need to be evidence of a crime. It could be evidence of some other violation, a non-criminal violation. And also, because the target of a suspicious activity report is prohibited from finding out, it would actually be very hard for the person to go to court later and challenge it unless they were the subject potentially of a prosecution, in which case you're already starting behind the eight ball.
Okay, so as we stand right now, the Fourth Amendment relative to your banking records, which don't just say what you spent money on, it says where you were. Because by definition, when you put that credit card into the gas pump, we know exactly where you were. So there's nothing that stops government from finding out not only what you're spending on, but where you are and what you're doing. Is that correct?
Sir, that's absolutely correct. And the reason for that is, from the court's perspective, those records aren't yours. They belong to the bank, and therefore you have no protectable privacy right in them. But the court recently has been starting to change their thinking on that type of thing.
Well, and we're hoping to spur the court to think more through legislation. Summarizing, though, we're talking mostly about bank records because those are the ones that we have a current example. But isn't it true that the FBI and other agencies want the same access to all of your phone records, which would include where you are moment by moment and who you talk to? Is that correct?
Well, yes, that was an issue in the Carpenter case, where law enforcement tried to pull location data from cell phone towers, and the court found that customers have a protectable Fourth Amendment right, even though those records belong to the phone company, not to the customer.
So, in closing, for everyone here, if I want to get those kinds of records on the FBI, in the case of your phone records, for all practical purposes, there are exigent circumstance exceptions, but for all practical purposes, you need to get a warrant. You don't need it for bank records, but isn't it true that those records very often provide the same information and thus are equally invasive into not just your First Amendment, your Fourth Amendment reasonable expectation for privacy and the keeping of your files and personal effects?
I would argue they're potentially more sensitive and can provide more accurate information than cell phone towers.
Well, I, for one, would close by saying that I don't see a problem getting warrants. I don't see a problem getting judges, and this committee has a significant role with FISA and other cases like that. The question is, will we amend law so that no matter where the data is being grabbed by the government, it's being grabbed pursuant to a reasonable expectation that you have a reason to get it and a judge who agrees. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their willingness to testify before the committee. As evidenced by today's hearing, the singular mission of this so-called subcommittee on weaponization and the House Republican leadership appears to be the proliferation, or ironically, the weaponization of false narratives for political purposes. Combined with the rudderless efforts to develop evidence for the impeachment of President Biden, these proceedings have become increasingly bizarre at every turn. You know, once upon a time, we were told that the key to all of this was the Hunter Biden laptop. That was the smoking gun that would solve all of this. Until then, it wasn't. Then it was getting Hunter Biden to testify. That was going to be the conclusive evidence. Until at one point he had the courage to walk into a hearing, sit in the front row, and then all of a sudden Republicans rejected his offer to testify publicly and instead voted to hold him in contempt. Then it was going to be the testimony of the Republicans' top legal expert witnesses who were going to appear before Congress and offer evidence against President Biden and lay out the legal theory to justify articles of impeachment. But they showed up, all of them with great resumes, but with no evidence. And they testified under oath, that they could not find any evidence that would support or suggest such charges. And finally, last month, the Trump-appointed special counsel, David Weiss, announced that he had indicted Chairman Jim Jordan's star witness, former FBI informant Alexander Smirnov, for making false statements and fabricating evidence to federal investigators about President Biden and his family, including the shameless lie that President Biden sought millions in bribes from Ukrainian energy company Burisma when he served as vice president. Now, Smirnov, some of you may not remember, but Smirnov is the guy that Chairman Jordan described, and I'll give you a quote, the chairman's quote, as providing, quote, the most corroborating evidence the Republicans have, close quote, in support of impeachment. So given that Smirnov is being charged by the Republican Trump-appointed special counsel for lying and fabricating evidence, and the pathetic show that the Republicans have put on so far, that assessment is probably correct. He's probably the best they've got. Now the chairman of this subcommittee is determined to obscure the facts surrounding January 6th. Today's hearing appears to be based on the false narrative that conservative Americans and even Bible purchasers are the targets of pervasive and baseless financial surveillance by the federal government. It also follows statements made by several House members downplaying the attacks that Officer Fanon has described at the U.S. Capitol complex as, quote, acts of vandalism, close quote, and a normal tourist visit. That could not be further from the truth. As reported by the Bipartisan Select Committee on January 6th in its final report, our nation endured an insurrection that specifically sought to violently block congressional certification of the 2020 presidential election. The sheer scale of the mob violence that you saw on the video earlier and the lawlessness that was exhibited that day tested the very fabric of our democracy, with rioters savagely beating law enforcement officers like Officer Fanon amid repeated crowd chants such as hang Mike Pence, shoot him with his own gun. The Republican vice president, hang Mike Pence. That's what makes you an extremist. That's what makes you a terrorist. Not just your desire to purchase under the Second Amendment a weapon that you're legally entitled to have. It also warranted additional investigatory investigatory efforts by federal law enforcement authorities to prevent more violence leading up to the 2021 presidential inauguration. Officer Fanone, as a former Metropolitan Police officer, could you please tell us how the promulgation of false narratives, like this was just a tourist visit or simple vandalism, how that distorted description affects your ability to do your job?
Thank you for the question. Well, essentially, the distortions, mischaracterizations, and lies about January 6th resulted in, or at least partially played a role in me leaving my job as a Metropolitan Police officer. They have inspired fellow Americans to threaten me, threaten members of my family, simply because of the statements that I've made about my experience, both on January 6, 2021, and in the aftermath.
Well, thank you very much. My time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous
Mr.
consent request.
Fanone, I would thank you for your service.
Gentleman yields
I have
back.
a unanimous consent request, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady may state her request.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a January 7th, 2021 email from the FBI to financial institutions requesting information about Edward Florea because he, quote, claimed to be armed and intending to travel to D.C. to unleash, quote, some violence. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a press release from the Eastern District of New York announcing Edward Florea's sentencing for making threats to kill elected officials like Senator Raphael Warnock, entitled, quote, Queens man sentenced to 33 months in Thank you.